My sister's lies ruined my life and my family disowned me. Now they want me back years later. Man, I've been staring at this blank screen for like an hour, trying to figure out how to start. I guess I should just get into it. This is pretty heavy stuff, and it's taken me years to be ready to write it all down. So, yeah. I'm Eric, 33 years old, and this story is about how my sister, I'll call her Ann, completely destroyed my life with a lie and what happened after that. But to understand everything, you need to know what things were like before it all went bad. Growing up, Ann and I were super close, probably closer than most brothers and sisters, even with the 4-year age gap. We were basically best friends. I know that sounds weird now, given everything that happened, but back then, it was just normal. I was never the smartest kid in school, I always struggled with grades and barely passed most classes. But I was really into electronics, not programming or computers, more like taking things apart and putting them back together. It started with old TV remotes and radios I'd find at yard sales. By the time I was 16, I had this whole setup in my room: soldering iron, multimeters, boxes full of circuit boards and wires. My parents thought it was weird, especially since I'd spend hours in there with the door locked. Yeah, that becomes important later. But Ann got it. She was about 10 when I started getting serious about it, and she'd just sit in my room for hours watching me work. She'd ask all these questions about what different parts did, why I was connecting certain wires, and sometimes, she'd help me organize my parts or hold stuff while I soldered. It was our thing, you know. Our parents definitely played favorites, though. And was this perfect kid, straight A's, gymnastics team, student council, the whole package. Meanwhile, I was barely passing classes and spending all my time either in my room with electronics or at the skate park. But Ann always had my back. Like this one time in my junior year, I got caught smoking behind the gym. Instead of letting me get suspended, Ann made up this whole story about how I was just holding the cigarette for someone else who ran away. She even did the whole crying thing to the principal about how I was trying to turn my life around and a suspension would ruin everything. The principal totally bought it. She helped me with homework too. She was way better at explaining stuff than my teachers, like she'd break down math problems in a way that actually made sense to me. That was probably the only reason I graduated high school, to be honest. I looked out for her too. Being the big brother, I was pretty protective, maybe too protective looking back. Any guy who showed interest in her had to deal with me first. I wasn't trying to be a jerk about it, I just didn't want some random dudes messing with my little sister. Even when I started getting into trouble, staying out late, hanging with the wrong crowd, and never judging me, she'd cover for me with our parents, make excuses when I missed curfew. One time, I came home at 3 a.m. and she was sitting on the porch waiting for me. Just wanted to make sure I got home safe. Looking back now, maybe we were too close. Maybe that's why it was so easy for people to believe what she said later. But back then, it just felt normal. She was my sister, my best friend, the only person who really got me. Our parents tried to get me interested in normal stuff. They'd sign me up for sports teams or after-school clubs, but I always went back to my electronics. They thought I was wasting my time, but Ann would defend me. "He's good at it," she'd say. "Let him do what he loves." That's the Ann I try to remember sometimes. The little sister who believed in me when nobody else did, the one who'd bring me snacks while I worked on projects, who'd defend me to our parents, who trusted me enough to come to me with her problems. But this is where everything started falling apart. I was 18, just barely graduated from high school. And was 16 and starting to get attention from guys at her school. Being the overprotective brother I was, I did what any big brother would do, I scared them off. Not like I was beating anyone up, just making sure they knew I was watching. There was this one guy, Jake, who was particularly persistent, a senior, driving a fancy car his parents bought him, typical rich kid stuff. I caught him trying to get Ann to skip class with him one day. I probably shouldn't have shoved him against his car, but come on, he was 18, trying to get my 16-year-old sister to skip school. What brother wouldn't be pissed? That's when the rumors started. At first, it was just whispers, people at Ann's school saying stuff about how weird it was that I was so protective. Then it got worse. Someone started saying the reason I didn't want other guys near Ann was because I wanted her for myself. Sick stuff like that. I remember the exact moment I realized something was really wrong. It was a Tuesday after school. Usually, Anne would come to my room to hang out while I worked on my projects, but this time, she just went straight to her room. When I knocked on her door to check on her, she told me to go away. I found her crying in the kitchen. Later that night, when I tried to hug her like I always did when she was upset, she actually flinched away from me. That had never happened before. She mumbled something about being tired and went back to her room. The next few days were weird. She stopped coming to my room, stopped talking to me altogether. I figured she was just going through some teenage phase or something. I should have known better. Then one morning, I was working on an old radio I'd found, and I hear someone knocking on our front door. Not like normal knocking, but that loud, official kind of knock that immediately makes your stomach drop. 2 cops and some lady in a suit were standing there. When my dad opened the door, they asked to speak with him privately. First, I could hear them talking in the kitchen, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. Then my dad called me down. I'll never forget the look on his face, like he was looking at a stranger. The lady in the suit introduced herself as being from CPS. She said they needed to ask me some questions about my relationship with Anne, turns out, and had gone to her guidance counselor and told them I'd been touching her inappropriately. She said that's why I was always in my room with the door locked, that I made her come in there and, yeah, you can figure out the rest. She told them I threatened to hurt her if she ever told anyone, that's why I was so aggressive with guys who showed interest in her. She even said I used the electronic stuff as a cover, that the wires and zip ties in my room were for other things. My dad didn't even question it. Not once. He just stood there nodding as they talked, like suddenly, everything made sense to him. All those hours in my room, the locked door, the protectiveness over Anne. In his mind, it all added up to something sick. I tried to explain, showed them my projects, the half-fixed radio on my desk, the boxes of circuit boards and old electronics. Tried to tell them about how Anne used to sit and watch me work, how she'd help me organize parts. But they'd already made up their minds. The CPS lady kept asking these leading questions. Did you make Anne feel special by letting her help you? Did you tell her she was different from other girls? Everything I said just made it sound worse. When they asked about the time I pushed Jake, and had twisted that too. She said I was jealous because she was starting to like other guys, that I couldn't handle her growing up and having normal relationships because it meant losing control over her. None of it was true, but the way she told it, even I almost believed it. And then, I lost it right there in front of everyone. Anne, what the hell are you saying? My voice cracked, not from anger, but from sheer disbelief. She wouldn't look at me. Anne, look at me. She kept her eyes on the floor, arms wrapped around herself like she was some fragile little thing that needed protection. That little act just made me angrier. You know this isn't true. You know it. I turned to our dad, desperate. Dad, come on, you know me. I would never. He cut me off, his voice low, steady, but his face, I'd never seen him look at me like that before. Not disappointed, not angry, just done. You don't even want to hear me out. I took a step forward, but he put his hand up like I was some kind of threat and flinched. That was it. That was when I knew. You can't seriously believe this. My voice dropped, all the fight suddenly drained out of me. I looked at and again, really looked at her. She still wouldn't meet my eyes. Why are you doing this? I whispered. She finally looked up. She was going to say something, maybe even take it all back. But then she glanced at Dad, at the CPS lady, at the cop standing in our living room, and that's when she doubled down. Her eyes filled with tears, she took a shaky breath, and whispered, I'm sorry, Eric. Right then, I understood. She wasn't going to take it back. Because it was too late. Because she was in too deep. Because she was scared of the consequences. I laughed. Actually laughed. Wow, I said. You're really doing this. You're actually doing this. She squeezed her arms around herself tighter. I just couldn't keep it in anymore. Dad clenched his jaw. Get your things. We're going to the station. And that was it. No trial, no evidence, no real questions. Just my dad driving me to the police station in silence, like I was already guilty. Like I was a stranger. Like I wasn't his son anymore. On the way to the station, all I could think about was how they made it all fit. The lonely older brother who spent all his time alone in his room. The weird hobby with all the tools and wires. The aggressive protectiveness. The close relationship that suddenly turned bad. They saw exactly what they wanted to see. The interview room at the police station was exactly like you see in movies. They left me sitting there for what felt like hours before two detectives came in. The male detective, Rivers, played good cop. He kept saying stuff like, "We just want to understand what happened. Eric, help us help you." The female detective, don't remember her name, just sat there, taking notes and giving me these looks like I was dirt. Rivers started going through my electronics hobby. "Tell me about the things you build," he said, trying to sound interested. So I explained about fixing old radios, building simple circuits, basic stuff. "And would help you with these projects?" "Yeah," I said. She'd organize parts, hold stuff while I soldered. She liked learning about it. The female detective cut in. "So you'd have her alone in your room, door locked, handling your equipment?" That's when it hit me. How they were twisting everything. Every normal thing suddenly sounded wrong. They kept pushing about the locked door. "I locked it because I had expensive tools," I tried explaining. "Dad would borrow stuff and not put it back." "Or maybe," Rivers said, his voice getting harder, "you locked it for other reasons." They had this whole file of evidence and statements about how I'd started touching and when she was 12, right when she started getting interested in my projects. How I used the electronics as a way to isolate her, made her feel special by teaching her things no one else knew. I said that's insane. She's my sister. I was teaching her because she was interested, not because of some sick obsession. But the female detective leaned forward. "Interested in electronics?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Or afraid of what would happen if she wasn't?" They brought up the Jake incident again. But in their version, I attacked him, because he was taking Anne away from me. They had statements from other kids at school, talking about how possessive I was, how I'd scared off any guy who came near her. Rivers pulled out photos from my room, taken that morning. They'd made it look like some kind of torture chamber, close-ups of my tools, the wires, the zip ties I used for cable management. Even my project notes looked sinister in their photos. "Your father says you'd spend hours alone with and in this room," Rivers said. "Wanna tell us what really happened in there?" I lost it. I started yelling about how they were making normal brother-sister stuff sound perverted. But Rivers just nodded, like I was confirming something. "Classic defensive reaction," he said to his partner. Then they brought up my grades, my lack of friends, the hours I spent alone in my room. They built this whole profile of an isolated, unstable guy obsessed with his sister. They weren't just investigating, they were building a case. And the more I denied it, the more guilty I looked. My lawyer, if you could even call her that, barely fought back. "We need to consider a plea deal," she told me, like it was my only option. "If this goes to trial, you could be facing 20 years in prison." After hours of this, Rivers finally said, "Look, Eric, here's the deal. We have enough for charges. Serious charges. But if you work with us, admit what happened, and show remorse, we can help you." "I didn't do anything wrong," I said, for probably the 100th time. "Then explain why and would make this up," Rivers said. I couldn't. Because it didn't make sense. My sister, who I'd protected, who I'd cared for, who used to wait up to make sure I got home safe, why would she do this? The next part is kind of a blur. There were meetings with lawyers. My parents had hired one for Anne, but told me I had to find my own. The public defender they gave me was fresh out of law school, and already convinced I was guilty. She told me my options, I could fight it, but she made it clear winning wasn't likely. "Juries believe victims," she said flatly. Anne is young, emotional, and convincing. She laid out the reality: if I went to trial, I was facing a potential 20 years in prison. The plea deal was mercy, 5 years probation, lifetime registry, but no jail. "If you take this to trial and lose," she warned, "you won't get another chance." My own parents weren't even in my corner. Dad just shook his head. Don't put your sister through a trial, he said. Just take the deal. But I'm innocent, I said. They all say that, she replied, without looking up from her papers. They have your sister's testimony, documentation of behavioral changes, witness statements about your possessive behavior. No jury will believe you over a traumatized 16-year-old girl. My dad came to see me once before I took the deal. I hadn't seen him since he dropped me at the station. I thought maybe he'd finally realize the truth. But instead, he said, just admit what you did, Eric. Don't make your sister go through a trial. Dad, please, I begged. You know me. You know I'd never. He cut me off. I thought I knew you. Guess I didn't. That was the last real conversation I had with my father. 2 days later, I took the deal. I pled no contest to sexual assault of a minor, got 5 years probation, and a lifetime on the registry. Some of you might wonder why I'd plead if I was innocent. The truth is, they break you. They take every normal thing about your life and twist it until you can't even trust your own memory. And when everyone, your family, the cops, even your own lawyer, believes you're guilty, you start thinking maybe fighting is pointless. Being on the list destroys your life in ways you'd never expect. Everyone talks about the big stuff, can't live near schools, can't get certain jobs, etc., but it's the small things that really get to you. The first place I tried to rent after everything, the lady was all set to let me sign the lease. Then she did the background check. I still remember her face when she saw what came up. She actually backed away from me like I was going to attack her, right there in her office. I'm sorry, she said. I have grandchildren who visit. I'm sure you understand. That became my life, people being sorry while treating me like some kind of monster. Finding work was a nightmare. Most places wouldn't even look at my application once they saw I had to check that box. The few interviews I did get usually ended the same way, we'll call you. They never did. I finally found this guy, Mike, who ran a small manufacturing company. He hired people others wouldn't, ex-cons, addicts trying to get clean, guys like me. The pay was garbage and the work was hard, but at least it was something. Mike told me on my first day, I don't care what you did. Just show up on time and do your job. I worked there for almost 2 years. Then someone found out about me and started causing problems, telling other workers they shouldn't have to work with someone like me, that I was dangerous. Mike tried to stand up for me, but eventually, he had to let me go. I can't risk losing my whole workforce, he said. But at least he gave me decent severance pay. I lost my apartment right after that. Ended up living in my car for a while. Planet Fitness membership became my best friend, $10 a month for a place to shower and use the bathroom. I'd park in 24-hour Walmart lots to sleep. Security usually left you alone if you didn't cause trouble. The worst part wasn't even the practical stuff, though. It was watching life go on without me through mutual friends on Facebook, before they banned me. I saw in graduating high school with honors, going to college on a full scholarship, meeting this rich guy, Billy, at some campus event. Meanwhile, I was eating cold ravioli from a can in my car, trying to figure out where I could park for the night without getting hassled by cops. I made the mistake of trying to date once. Met this girl, Sarah, at one of my jobs. She was nice, didn't ask too many questions about my past. We went out a few times. Things were going good. Then she asked why I always had to check the address of wherever we were going. I decided to be honest. I told her about the registration requirement, how I had to be careful about where I went. Tried to explain that I was innocent, that it was a false accusation. She said she needed time to think. The next day, her brother and 2 of his friends showed up at my work. Had to quit that job too. I started hanging out at this little library branch after that. The librarian there kind of figured out my situation but never said anything. She'd just leave books she thought I'd like on the returns cart. A lot of technical manuals, electronics books, guess she noticed what I usually read. One day, she caught me looking at online courses and sat down to help me find free ones I could take. Education is everyone's right, she said. She was the only person who treated me like a human being in years. I started learning about cryptocurrency through those courses. Figured it was something I could do without anyone checking my background. Turned out I had a knack for understanding the technical side of it. Made a little money here and there trading. But you know what really messed me up? Seeing comments on Anne's social media, people talking about how brave she was, how amazing it was that she'd overcome her trauma to be so successful. She even wrote this article for her college paper about being a survivor. People were calling her an inspiration. Meanwhile, I was barely surviving. Funny how that works, right? I used to think about trying to clear my name, but who would believe me? And was this perfect, successful college student? I was just some creep living in his car. The system doesn't care about people like me. That's how I spent most of my 20s, moving from job to job, place to place, never staying anywhere long enough for people to find out about me, never making friends because what's the point when they'll just leave once they know? Some nights, I'd lay in my car, looking at old family photos on my phone, pictures of me and Anne when we were kids, trying to figure out where it all went wrong. What I could have done differently. That's the thing about being on the list, it doesn't just take away your freedom. It takes away your past, your future, your whole identity. You stop being a person and become a label. But suddenly, everything changed. It was just a normal Tuesday. I was at work, found another factory job, better than the last one, when I got this email from some private investigator. Almost deleted it, thinking it was spam. But something made me read it. The PI said he'd been hired by Anne's husband, Billy, to look into her past. Yes, she'd been acting weird lately, and Billy started digging. The PI had found inconsistencies in her story about me and wanted to talk. I ignored it at first. Had enough people mess with my life already. But then he sent another email with proof he was legit, court documents, case files, stuff I'd never seen before. We met at this diner just outside town. The PI, I'll call him Frank, had this massive folder of documents. Your sister's story is falling apart, he said, spreading papers across the table. Been doing this job 30 years. Never seen someone mess up their own lie this bad. It turns out Anne had been sloppy. Really sloppy. The timeline she gave about when stuff supposedly happened didn't match school records. The witness statements from her friends changed every time she told the story. But what completely blindsided me was this: remember Jake, the senior who kept hitting on her? Turns out he wasn't just some guy sniffing around. Anne had been secretly dating him. And not just that, she got caught in his car, doing things she definitely wasn't supposed to be doing. She was convinced I was going to tell our parents about it, maybe because she knew I'd always been protective, or maybe just out of pure panic. Either way, she needed a distraction. Something big enough, shocking enough to make sure no one even thought about Jake. So she made up the accusations. Knowing that once those words were out, nothing else would matter. Frank had texts between Anne and her friends from back then, screenshots she thought were deleted. In them, she literally planned the whole thing, talked about how she needed a nuclear option to keep me quiet. She didn't expect it to go as far as it did, Frank said. Seems like she thought they'd just send you away to live with relatives or something. But when Dad went full scorched earth, she was too scared to take it back. I just sat there, reading through everything. Seeing the proof of what I'd known all along, everything I'd suspected, was a strange, bitter kind of relief. Frank kept talking. Billy had hired him because Anne had been acting strange lately, drinking too much, getting paranoid. Billy had found her crying over old family photos one night, and when he asked about me, she completely shut down. That's when he called Frank. Then Frank pulled out one last document, a signed confession from Anne. Billy had confronted her with all the evidence, and she broke down, telling him everything. I need you to understand something, Frank said. This isn't going to magically fix everything. The legal system doesn't like admitting it made a mistake, but it's a start. He left me with copies of everything. I spent that whole night reading through it all, the texts where she planned it, the confession where she finally admitted the truth, even posts she'd made on some forum asking how to make abuse allegations more believable. The next day, I called a lawyer, a real one this time. Not some overworked public defender who had already decided I was guilty. We filed for post-conviction relief based on new evidence. My lawyer said Anne's confession, combined with the discrepancies Frank uncovered, was strong enough to vacate my conviction and get me removed from the registry. It took months of hearings, but eventually, a judge ruled in my favor. My record was wiped clean. I should have felt relief. I should have felt something. But all I could think about was how long it had taken, how much I had lost in the process. A week later, an envelope landed in my mailbox. No return address, but I knew who it was from before I even opened it. My parents. The first contact in 10 years. My hands shook as I tore it open, not from excitement but sheer disbelief. Inside was a letter written in my dad's stiff, impersonal handwriting. They wanted to meet. Said and had finally come clean, well, partially. She spun some watered-down version of the truth, painting herself as a scared little girl who made a terrible mistake. No mention of the calculated lies, the years of suffering she'd put me through. But apparently, it was enough for them to finally believe I was innocent. Tucked inside the envelope was a check for $50,000, a number that probably felt generous to them, like it could somehow erase a decade of being treated like a monster. Like it could buy back my stolen years, my dignity, my life. I held it up to the light for a second, then laughed. Nothing had changed. They still thought problems could be solved with a price tag. Money wasn't what I needed. I needed the truth to be known, and I needed to hear it from someone else's mouth. So I took the number Frank gave me and called him. My hands were shaking when I finally dialed. He answered after a few rings. His voice was weary. "Billy?" I said. There was a long pause, then cautiously, "Eric?" I let that sting for a second before answering, "Anne's brother." Silent. Then a low, humorless chuckle. That's funny, because Anne never mentioned having a brother. Never mentioned any family. I swallowed down the immediate anger rising in my chest. Yeah, that tracks. Can't have the skeletons in her closet running their mouths, right? Billy exhaled sharply. Jesus, I knew she was hiding things, but this. I've been married to this woman for years, had a kid with her, and I didn't even know she had a brother. Not one she didn't completely destroy. First, I said flatly. There was another pause before he muttered, "Unbelievable." His voice had that tight, realizing tone, just how deep they'd been played. Then he sighed, and when he spoke again, his voice was firm, final. "I'm filing for divorce." I didn't say anything at first. Just let the weight of his words settle between us. Finally, I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "Good," I said. "You deserve better." I hung up after that. No point in saying anything else. But as I set my phone down, a strange sense of relief washed over me. Then I found the social media posts and deactivated all her accounts, but not before posting this long apology about how she'd remembered things wrong as a teenager, made herself sound like the victim somehow. Poor, confused girl who made a mistake, now bravely coming forward with the truth. Her perfect life started falling apart. After that, Billy filed for divorce. The school where she worked, yeah, she became a teacher, imagine that, asked her to resign. Turns out they don't like having teachers who've admitted to making false abuse allegations. Found out later that Billy got full custody of their kid, using Anne's confession to prove she was unstable. She tried to fight it, but Frank's investigation had uncovered other lies too. Lots of them. The real truth, she'd been lying about everything for years. Not just about me, she'd made up stories about other people too. Had this whole pattern of accusing guys of stuff when things didn't go her way. Some people asked why she finally confessed. According to Frank, my parents had started noticing things. And had been acting erratic for months, disappearing for hours without explanation, having sudden outbursts over nothing, drinking too much at family gatherings. But the final straw came when she slipped up. That was during a heated argument with my mom. She blurted something out, something about how Eric wouldn't have suffered if Dad hadn't overreacted. My mom froze. Pressed her for details and tried to backtrack, but it was too late, the doubt had already been planted. My dad, ever the controlling figure, started digging. He reached out to people from Anne's past, even called her old high school friends, and just like that, the cracks in her story started showing. By the time Billy hired Frank, Anne was already spiraling, trying to patch together a lie that was quickly falling apart. So when Billy confronted her with the evidence, the texts, the inconsistencies, the proof she thought was long buried, she broke. And that's when my phone rang. It was my mother, her voice shaky like she had been crying for hours. "Eric, please, we need to talk." I almost hung up right then, but something in her tone kept me on the line. She started rambling about Anne, about how she had finally told them her side of things, how she admitted she had made some mistakes, but that she had been young, scared, confused. "She's not the same person anymore," my mother insisted. "She's broken, Eric," she continued. "She cries every day. She knows she ruined your life, and she can barely live with herself." Then they actually asked, "Can't you just forgive her?" That made my blood boil. Forgive? If she had borrowed my car and crashed it, sure. If she had stolen some money from me, fine. But she hadn't done any of that. She'd stripped away my entire life, left me in ruins, while she got to move on and play the victim for years. "You don't understand," my mom continued. I cut her off, voice cold. "She made a choice." I let the silence sit between us for a moment. "Then, you made a choice too." I looked directly at my father, who flinched under my stare. "You believed her without a second thought. You let them take me without hesitation." Dad shut his eyes for a moment, like he could block out the truth. My mom's voice was barely above a whisper. "She's not the same person anymore." I let out a dry chuckle. "Neither am I." And that was the real tragedy, wasn't it? The person they had known, the boy who spent hours in his room fixing radios, who would have done anything for his little sister, he was gone. They had buried him a decade ago when they let the cops take me away. I grabbed the check my father had put on the table earlier, $50,000. A number they had probably pulled out of thin air, thinking money could erase what they had done. I stared at it for a second, then ripped it in half. "I don't need your money," I said. "I don't need anything from you." My mom started sobbing. My dad said nothing. He just sat there, like a man finally realizing he had lost something he could never get back. I stood up. "You made your choice," I said quietly. "Now you get to live with it." I walked out without looking back. I didn't feel anything when I left that restaurant, no rush of victory, no weight off my shoulders. Just nothing. And maybe that was the real quote. A few weeks later, I got a letter in the mail. No return address, but I knew who it was from before I even opened it. It was from Anne. I stared at the envelope for a long time before finally opening it. The letter inside was short. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I just wanted to say I'm sorry." That was it. No excuses. No explanation. Just that. I held it for a moment, then set it down. And I never wrote back. And yeah, life didn't magically become perfect after that. The damage had been done, and I would always carry the scars of those 10 years. But I was finally free, really free. With my record expunged, I could finally live without the weight of my past hanging over me. I moved to a new city, started fresh, built up my electronics repair business from the ground up. And I never looked back. As for my parents, all of it, they became ghosts of a life I had left behind. Maybe one day I'd think about them and feel something. But for now, I was finally living my life on my own terms. And that was enough.